A couple weeks ago, I discovered the delicious treat that is cotton candy flavored marshmallow peeps, and eating them is a very similar experience to watching the John Wick movies. You get a sense that there's really no substance to what you're experiencing, but the flavor is so good you don't really care. Watching John Wick Chapter 4 is like eating a barrel of cotton candy peeps. I'm not really going to talk about the plot of this movie. I don't really want to spoil too much because I know this movie just hit theaters, but there probably will be a couple minor spoilers in here, so you've been warned. Let's get the stuff about the writing out of the way at the beginning. Super unremarkable. It's a John Wick movie. You didn't go watch it for some intellectual meditation on like the nature of contract killing. You wanted to see him kill a guy with like a lint roller or something. The characters are predictable, the plot's pretty straightforward, and on the acting front, it's no surprise everyone's kind of just phoning it in. At this point, I've gotten used to just ignoring the acting and dialogue in John Wick movies, and I think that they do all these dramatic pauses between each line to be over the top, kind of on purpose, but every line of dialogue in these movies has these long pauses before and after them. The characters deliver every line like it's a poetry recitation, and it keeps with that over-the-top drama kind of a thing, but I think it kind of got old after like one movie, so don't expect to be impressed by the quality of the dialogue in this movie. Also, I think he's a really fun action star, and I love watching him do the fight scenes in these movies, but Keanu Reeves does not do any acting in these movies. Every line he delivers is just completely flat. It sounds like he's reading it off a piece of paper. Also, I do not know who was in charge of assigning accents in these movies. Lance Reddick, who I love, was given a terrible, like, African accent. Why did they make him do that? His normal voice is absolutely sick.
The tree that doesn't bend breaks, Cedric.
Been too far. You're already broken.
The main villain of this movie has one of the worst French accents I've ever heard in my life. This man is Swedish. You couldn't have made his character just have like a Swedish accent or like hired a French guy if you wanted the villain to be French. It's like a relatively small thing, but it kind of breaks the illusion of the movie when this supposedly menacing villain is just absolutely butchering a French accent with every line. The only person I think who gives a good performance in this movie is Ian McShane as Winston. He's pretty solid in all these movies. Oh, also Donnie Yen is in this movie, and his fight scenes are pretty neat, but his acting is kind of mid. And speaking of his fight scenes, his character is blind in this movie, and the way that the creators of this movie portrayed his fighting style as a blind person was pretty cool. There's a scene in this movie where he uses these proximity alarms in a fight to figure out where his enemies are and like where to shoot, and that was really cool to see. But the creators definitely start thinking less and less about his blindness as the movie goes on, and by the end of the movie it kind of feels like he's not blind, like they kind of just forgot about that. Like there's a setup at the beginning of this movie that I felt like they never paid off on, where this blind guy can't tell if he's actually killed John because John Wick is just lying silently on the floor, and I kind of thought they would like come back to that or like make that come into play when the two of them fought later in the movie, but it never comes back. Kind of weird. My biggest issue with this movie is its inconsistent pacing. The first half is very slow, but by the time you get to the nightclub fight scene around the halfway point, it really just accelerates through the finish line. But yeah, the first half of this movie really drags. The plot elements and the dialogue are sluggish, and whereas those things are usually made bearable by well-crafted and tightly paced fight scenes, the fights in the first half of this movie only serve to make the pacing even worse. And that's because this movie repeats a lot of the mistakes that John Wick 3 makes in constructing its fight scenes at the beginning. At the beginning of this movie, like every single person is wearing bulletproof armor, and by giving everyone bulletproof armor, the use of guns becomes much less impactful. In a gunfight with no armor, every time you hit someone, it's devastating. So in a fight with like John Wick versus 8 people, that fight might be over in like 8 moves, so to speak, because each move could be devastating. And in a fist fight, enemies require a lot of hits to go down, so those fights tend to take a lot longer. So that same fight with 8 people unarmed might take 40 or 50 moves. But this added fight time is compensated for by unarmed hand-to-hand combat being more interesting to watch. You can see how nimble or how skilled a fighter is by looking at the kinds of clever moves and environmental manipulation he can pull off to take out his opponents. The gunfights with body armor at the beginning of this movie keep the length of unarmed fight scenes without any of that visually interesting combat. There's nothing interesting about watching John Wick shoot a guy with armor in the head 3 times, and then that guy will like stumble around for a bit all stunned, while John Wick does that to some other guy, and then John Wick turns back to the first guy and finishes him off with a close range shot to the head. That happens like 50 times at the beginning of this movie. The fight scene at the end of John Wick 3 in the hotel suffers from this same problem. There's so much enemy downtime and not enough interesting stuff that the protagonist is doing, because all he's doing is just pointing and shooting at people over and over again. So it feels like the fight drags on and on. Each move in the fight is less consequential, to put it concisely. And if you combine that with the fact that we just watched John Wick take on like wave after wave of like 3 enemies at a time in a setting that isn't really remarkable, you add up to a fight scene that feels like it's kind of just spinning its wheels for like 10 minutes. And by contrast, the knife fight at the start of John Wick 3 is like one of the coolest fight scenes I've ever seen. There are only a few enemies, and John Wick has to use any weapons he can get his hands on to take them out. You get a real sense of his skill in hand-to-hand combat. There's like an overall sense of improvisation and desperation to the fight. There's very little wasted time. The fights in John Wick 4 in the Osaka Continental, which are at the beginning of this movie, are an absolute chore to get through, but the fights at the end are absolutely amazing because the creators found ways to make gunplay interesting. There's a fight that happens in the middle of a busy street, for example, that uses movement to increase the difficulty of acquiring targets. The cars are all whizzing by, preventing people from moving in directions they want to go in, and they're presenting constant hazards that John Wick is able to exploit by hurling people into oncoming traffic. And the cars also present options for temporary cover, which makes the environment extremely dynamic and interesting to watch. Something that's giving someone cover in 1 minute might be gone a second later. I absolutely love that fight scene, and it's immediately followed by this other fight scene where the creators used clever cinematography to enhance the interest of the combat. The entire scene is shot from the top down, like a bird's eye view, which lets us see enemies' lines of sight and John's lines of sight, and it lets us see what pieces of the environment are in between them. So you get a very clear sense of like where everyone is physically and what is like stopping them from seeing each other. And they used really low lighting so that every time a burst of gunfire happens, it kind of highlights where on the map, so to speak, the action is happening. These last two fight scenes I just talked about also make use of really clear objectives for John, which makes the fight scenes kind of feel more purposeful and targeted. And what I mean by this is, at the end of the movie, John Wick has to make his way to this church by sunrise, or he forfeits this duel that he has to fight, and the guy who he has to duel sends people to make sure he can't get to the church on time. So as he fights people in the road and fights people in this building, he's making progress towards his ultimate objective. But by contrast, the fight scenes at the beginning of the movie are just survival scenes. He just has to fight wave after wave of interchangeable goons, and there's like no real reason that the last wave is the last wave. There's no progress being made. He could just as easily fight through 20 more waves of people, and it really wouldn't make a difference to like the dynamics or the mechanics of the fight. Anyways, the fights at the end in this movie are spectacular, really some of the best I've ever seen, and it absolutely more than makes up for the slow start of the movie. And I mean, in addition to these fight scenes, the cinematography in this movie is fantastic. There are so many shots that make use of really interesting lighting or placement of scenery. I would say there were very few shots that I didn't find myself admiring. The creators set a lot of the movie in these neon-lit rooms that allowed them to play with colors in a way that the last couple John Wick movies really haven't, and it really stands out. The cinematography is fantastic. When I finally surfaced from the barrel of marshmallow peeps that was John Wick 4, I found myself satisfied, if not emotionally or intellectually affected. A movie like this is never going to blow you away with some insanely complex narrative or deeply interesting characters, but sometimes you're just in the mood to turn your brain off and just feast your eyes, and when that mood strikes, your eyes will thank you for watching John Wick 4. On the whole, I recommend it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.